People are making their way in. We have some food and drinks here. For those of you online, I hope that you are cozy in your home, even though it's 50 degrees outside here in Minnesota in January, which is a little disturbing. But there's definitely no weather excuse, but I'm sure people are in the comfort of their own home, and that's good too. My name is Rai Sigelko, and I'm the director of the Leadership Center for Social Justice here at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. For those of you who are new to the center, I want to extend a warm welcome. And for those of you who have been to our events before or who have participated in our programming, we welcome you as well. We are now about 16 months old, which I guess means that we're toddling around at this point. We started in September 2022, and at the heart of our center is a 9-month cohort-based program for faith leaders who are seeking to deepen their ministries in social justice. If you are interested in learning more about our program for yourself as a faith leader, as a chaplain, as a pastor, or other kind of minister, please look into our program on our website. We'll put that in the chat, the link. Or perhaps you might know a minister that might be interested in our program, which starts in September and is a 9-month program, as I said, and ends in May. In addition to our 9-month program, the center has a podcast featuring conversations with leading scholars and organizers from all around the world who are addressing a range of urgent social issues. The podcast is called the Leadership Center for Social Justice Podcast. You can also find the link in the chat. We also hold community events, including a quarterly queer and trans theology salon, a summer gathering celebrating the Mississippi River called Spirit of Water, and panel conversations like this one tonight. Our event tonight, Caregivers in a Careless Society, a panel on care work and social justice, is part of a new series at the center that we're calling Acting Together, a series on accompaniment. The series is inspired by the Quaker activists Stoughton and Alice Lind. In memory of Stoughton, who died at the end of 2022, and in collaboration with his widow Alice, his lifelong companion and co-conspirator, we are excited to feature this series of conversations exploring the various dimensions of accompaniment and the possibilities it holds today for the work of social justice. If you're interested in learning more about Alice and Stoughton, I would encourage you to listen to the podcast. Actually, I interviewed Alice. She's 94 and incredibly smart and has incredible wisdom. And you can learn more about Stoughton and Alice online. And we will have another event coming up, which is actually a documentary about their life. We'll have the documentarian there as well to talk about the making of that film. Our next event in the series is on Wednesday, March 6th at 7 p.m. We will be hosting the Reverend Mark Koyama of the Sacred Ally Quilt Ministry, and that'll take place here. And then on Wednesday, April 10th, as I mentioned, we'll be hosting a documentary viewing of Accompanying, the Journey of Stoughton and Alice Lind, and a panel conversation with Alice, the documentarian Catherine Murphy, and the award-winning historian Marcus Rediger, and a special guest from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, Zohara Simmons, who was actually a SNCC veteran, a SNCC worker in the summer of 1964 in Mississippi. So that'll be a very special evening. That event will be held at the University of St. Thomas and will be co-sponsored by the Justice and Peace Studies program there, as well as the East Side Freedom Library in St. Paul. So that'll be a fun event. You won't want to miss that on April 10th. To learn more about these events and to stay up to date on other upcoming events and offerings, please follow us on social media and sign up for our Substack newsletter. I've written a couple of posts, blog posts, but we need more followers to engage. So please do follow us on social media. Before I introduce the theme of our panel and our panelists, I want to say a few words on accompaniment. What does this mean? I think some of us have a sense about what it means to accompany, but what do we mean by it? In my recent interview with Alice Lind on the podcast, she described accompaniment as the idea of walking side by side with others on a journey together. She described accompaniment as an umbrella term that includes a family of related practices: equality, listening, seeking consensus, and exemplary action. The term is often associated with the pastoral letters of Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was assassinated in 1980. Romero described the kingdom of heaven as a reality that comes not only after death, but as something already inaugurated in history. In light of this reality, Romero urged the church to oppose the structural sin of capitalism by accompanying the poor in their struggle for justice and liberation. This ministerial task of accompaniment took root in the formation of base communities across Latin America and represented a distinctive form of ministry for social justice that began with the work of listening to the struggles and hopes of ordinary people and acting together concretely in the pursuit of another world. In contrast to top-down forms of organizing, such an approach to ministry echoes the strategies of grassroots social movements that have emerged from the bottom up in other times and places. It permeated the theory and practice of Ella Baker, the freedom schools of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in the 1960s, the ministries of Rosemary Freeney and Vincent Harding, and the practice of the late medical doctor Paul Farmer. Today, we witness multiple forms of accompaniment throughout the world. In the work of communities providing sanctuary for migrants, in neighborhoods that organize for mutual aid, and in movements of solidarity that defend the earth and the flourishing of life for all. And we witness accompaniment in the work of caregiving. Everyday forms of caregiving, unpaid forms of caregiving, and paid or professionalized forms of caregiving, which brings us to the theme of tonight's conversation. And I should say that tonight's conversation is especially inspired by the work of Paul Farmer, who recently died at the young age of 62, suddenly, in 2022. Paul Farmer was a founder of Partners in Health, an international nonprofit, a professor of medicine at Harvard, and a very significant figure in what has come to be called social medicine, a field that seeks to identify the social determinants of health. Dr. Farmer's work was deeply shaped by liberation theology, and he used this idea of accompaniment to describe his own work and practice. In fact, I wanted to show this book. It's called In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Dr. Paul Farmer and Father Gustavo Gutierrez, which I would highly recommend, which engages these themes between social medicine, health care, caregiving, accompaniment, within the frame of liberation theology. So the central questions this evening are the following. What is the relationship between care work and social justice? What difference would it make if the many caregivers of our world, and here I'm thinking of doulas, chaplains, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, pastors, nurses, doctors, you can add other titles to this. In some ways, we all participate in caregiving at one point or another in our lives. But what would we do if we were intentional about thinking about this question of the many caregivers of our world accompanying those with whom they care? What if they work together to transform our careless social structures? And what if the remedy to widespread caregiver burnout, which I know many of you are familiar with, was to be found in building infrastructures of care, social and economic and political structures of care, rather than the ever-increasing marketized practices of self-care. Now, of course, I'm not saying that self-care is bad, but we're seeing increasing, just take care of yourself more, just take care of yourself more. Well, what if we had social infrastructures that cared rather than infrastructures that were about securing corporate profit? And so tonight, these are the questions. So we have 4 esteemed panelists that have joined us for this conversation. I want to introduce them, and then we'll begin our conversation. We'll have until about 7:30 we'll be in conversation, then we'll open it up for Q&A. To my left, the Reverend Dr. Jessica Chapman-Lape is United's Assistant Professor and Program Director for Interreligious Chaplaincy. She received her PhD in Practical Theology from California's Claremont School of Theology. Jessica's research inhabits the intersection of spiritual care, health care, and reproductive justice. Her dissertation, Mistreated, a Womanist Clinical Pastoral Theology on the Mistreatment of African American Women in U.S. Healthcare, explores Black women's perceptions of cultural violence in U.S. healthcare systems and the subsequent role of spiritual care in interrupting such violence. Jessica's current research is working to expand paradigms of clinical spiritual care to include contextualized spiritual care practices such as Black Indigenous birth work. Next, to my left, to the left of, this is not necessarily political left, but maybe to the left of, but certainly geographically here, is the Reverend Laura Canada, a 2013 United alum and graduate of our Leadership for Social Justice program. She is a disability justice minister at Robbinsdale Parkway United Church of Christ. She is an all-around social justice ministry badass, if I might say so. I wrote that myself. She is also the Disability Ministries Board of Directors of the National UCC. She lives with chronic illness and mental health issues, but is disabled by attitudes and societal structures. She speaks the truth to power and writes prophetic poems. And she quotes the Bible almost as much as she quotes The Lord of the Rings. She also loves both people and animals. Dr. Michael Westerhouse graduated from Harvard Medical School in 2006. He practices at Health Partners Center for International Health. As a medical anthropologist, Dr. Westerhouse writes, I am very interested in understanding the impact of socioeconomics and culture on health and illness. In his role as a member of the Global Health faculty at the University of Minnesota, he works both in Minnesota and in northern Uganda to improve community-based primary care delivery, teach about the social determinants of health, and build partnerships based upon respect and equality that advance health for all. Mike is also on the leadership committee of Equal Health. And finally, Dr. Arthi Bhatt is an assistant professor of internal medicine and pediatrics at the University of Minnesota, where she completed a chief residency year in global health. She is also an associate program director for the MedPeds residency program and works as a primary care physician at the Community University Healthcare Center. Arthi is an active member of the Social Medicine Consortium and does community organizing through the Equal Health Campaign Against Racism, which also has a Minnesota chapter. Dr. Bott is a founding board member for Minnesota Doctors for Health Equity. She has a particular interest in using narrative health and community-centered approaches to dismantle the social forces of systemic racism that drive health inequity. Thank you to our panelists for being present. So I'd like to begin our conversation tonight by asking each of you to share a bit about your background and context and how you approach our theme this evening, exploring the intersections of care work and social justice within this framework of accompaniment. And we can begin with Dr. Chapman-Lape.
Good evening. Right, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm glad to be amongst such esteemed colleagues. So I teach interreligious chaplaincy here at United, and I've been a chaplain in nonprofit organizations and healthcare organizations for a little over 10 years now. I'm ordained and endorsed by the United Church of Christ, and prior to my ministry, my background was in public health, specifically reproductive health in the Black community. And so I entered into ministry and academia hoping to intersect these fields of reproductive health with theology and religion. And the world of spiritual care is where I situated myself to do that work. So in addition to chaplaincy, I'm a trained birth doula, and I'm trained in the tradition firmly grounded in enslaved midwifery practices. And through that lens, I see birth work as spiritual care. So to answer the question, I approach this idea of accompaniment as embodied in my roles as teacher, as chaplain, as doula, and also as mom and spouse and daughter and sister and auntie. And so I accompany people in my professional life and in my personal life. And I also approach this idea of accompaniment as an academic. In my womanist scholarship, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later, and in womanist spiritual care or womanist care, it really works with practices of journeying with, accompanying, Marsha Foster Boyd would say co-journeying with African American women, birthing and conceiving people. So I approach accompaniment with a scholarly lens as well.
Thank you. Laura, what about you?
As a minister, it is my job and pleasure to accompany people on their life's journeys. As a disability justice minister and as a person with disabilities, I educate people in the way we can make the world a better place for everyone. I follow the social model of disability, not the medical model, and that the medical model is, the person is a problem, the person has a problem, the person is broken. And the social model says society has a problem, society is broken and needs to be fixed. And I really focus on teaching people. That's what a main portion of my job is to teach people how to accompany people with disabilities and how to understand it from that lens point. Disability and mental health, again, are not, as I said, just an individual's issue. They are societal responsibilities, which I'll get into later. But when you see, one of the things that people see when they see someone with a disability is brokenness. And I want to push back on that a little bit. I'm not saying that's like a false equivalency, but brokenness is, everybody is broken. We're just broken in different ways. And instead of trying to fix an individual person, we should walk or roll or limp beside them, helping them on their journey as they help us on ours. There's an author, Eli Clare, he's a queer disabled author, and he writes about Care dismisses resilience, survival, the spiderweb of fractures, cracks, and seams. Its promise holds power precisely because none of us want to be broken. But I'm curious, what might happen if we were to accept, claim, and embrace our brokenness? And this isn't a biblical author, but to me that's a biblical response, and that's a disability justice response, and that is what I do.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I too am honored to be here tonight. When I think about the themes of caregiving and accompaniment and how they show up in my life, there's a couple ways. One is through practicing primary care. So I've been in a clinic in St. Paul in the Midway neighborhood, refugee health clinic, for about 12 years. And I feel like I am now sort of in the sweet spot of primary care where I have relationships with people for 10 to 12 years. And for me, that really is connected to accompaniment. I had the fortune of learning a lot from Partners in Health and Paul and many other people, Joya Mukherjee, and I think one of the lessons that I learned most in my training in global health was how important a long-term commitment to a place was. So a lot of global health work often is sort of built on sort of a 5-year cycle where you get a grant, you go in and do a project, and then you spend the last year or two doing a report. And when I was working with Paul and Partners in Health, their motto was very different. It was, we're here, we're connected, we're committed for the long term. And so had the chance to learn from them in Haiti and Uganda and Rwanda and just really see what that long-term commitment looks like. So for me, that's accompaniment. It's showing up, and it's showing up without any predetermined amount of time. And it's going to be showing up in more intense ways at some times and less intense ways at other times. And that whole idea of really like walking together is really, for me, about accompaniment. The other thing I think for me for caregiving that's really important too is I've also been a dad for about 12 years, the same amount of time as I've been a primary care, and doctor and I have learned a great deal about caregiving and accompaniment through that lens as well. So.
Thank you. Yes, very grateful to be here. And I just want to acknowledge that there's probably a lot of wisdom in this room around caregiving and accompaniment. And so just wanted to acknowledge that I don't think that I don't see myself as an expert in this topic in any way, shape, or form. However, I do think that it's something that that I sit with a lot as a primary care provider and a mother. It's really interesting that you mentioned liberation theology and Paul Farmer, because I went to Marquette University. That's where I did my undergraduate training, and that's where I learned about liberation theology, and it was a turning point for me as a young person who was wanting to sort of like make a difference in the world and understand like why things are the way that they are, which I think just personally stemmed a lot from growing up in a very homogenous small town in Wisconsin, and not being quite sure about what my identity was and what my role was in the world and how I was to relate to other people. And so something that I think is really important when I think about like accompaniment and care is also just like thinking about who I am and where am I positioned in relationship to other people. And so I just usually like to say that I identify as sort of a caste privileged South Asian American person. And my lineage is interesting in that my 2 to 3 generations of my family actually were migrated from India to East Africa because of the impacts of colonialism, British colonialism in India, that brought a lot of my family to East Africa to work in railroads. And so like colonialism is a part of my heritage, but also caste-based privilege is a part of my heritage. And so I think one of the things when I think about like, what does it mean to care for other people? What does it mean to accompany other people? I think it also means to hold the complexity of who we are and to be able to then hold that complexity in other people and to not necessarily, and to push away a little bit from this idea of there being a binary, right? There's a right or a wrong, or that biomedicine is better than other forms of healing, or that, that anyone has just a singular identity. That shapes who they are and how they move through the world. And so I think that I see accompaniment a lot in that way. I approach it that way as a mother, and I approach it that way in organizing work that I do with the Campaign Against Racism, which I think maybe I'll talk more about a little later.
Thank you. The COVID-19 pandemic reminded us of our dependence on one another for life, and perhaps especially our collective need for care. In a way, COVID was like a kind of X-ray of our society, making visible the radical inequalities produced by a social and economic system that prioritizes profit over care of people. We saw who was regarded as worthy of care and who was not. We saw whose work made them most vulnerable to the virus, the so-called essential workers, and whose work allowed them to stay at home. I think for many of us, this was a kind of revelation. I personally remember feeling in the early days of the pandemic a sense of optimism about this, that maybe now, I thought, we will come to realize the importance of centering infrastructures of care. But instead, the pandemic became so deeply politicized, especially in this country. And now, while things have changed, it's almost as if the pandemic didn't happen. I suppose I'm wondering, what lessons did we learn from COVID-19? And what lessons might we still need to learn so that we can better act to transform our systems of care today? This is a question for any of the panelists.
I guess I could go first. Yeah, I mean, I think that I work in a community health center. It's a federally qualified health center in Minneapolis in the Phillips neighborhood. And in my clinic, I take care of a lot of people who live at the margins of society, socioeconomically, racially, and ethnically. Many are migrants who came to the US sort of escaping certain persecutions and many of whom don't have health insurance or the sort of things that we would consider as safety nets to be able, even going into the pandemic. And I think that, so even going into the pandemic, I think that in the sort of intersection of where I worked, every day was sort of seeing how our system is not set up to actually care for people in many ways, and how our system is really disproportionately harms people who are living at the margins. And I think the pandemic really just, like you said, just ripped that wide open for the world to see. I would say that the majority of my patients are essential workers in some way, shape, or form. So the people that are growing the food that we eat, the people that are working in like the grocery stores or in the pharmacies or in the places that people needed to keep showing up physically, like in their jobs, so that, people could do the things that they need to do every day and have their basic needs met. And those people were not adequately protected or compensated or cared for as we're going through a global pandemic, and still aren't, right? I think I was feeling hopeful that there may be some policies that would come forward that would demonstrate that care. And there was a period of time where, you know, I thought, oh, like perhaps this really is like a turning point in sort of global consciousness around how we need to structure our society differently to support one another, because COVID has been sort of a mass disabling event for a lot of people, and a lot of people who are living paycheck to paycheck and just trying to make ends meet. And so one healthcare, you know, disaster would really make it hard to continue to like provide for families. That's the kind of thing that I deal with every day, and so I think if nothing else, I think the lesson that I would say that I learned from this pandemic that's ongoing is that solidarity is all we have, really. Like what we have is each other, and that we take care of each other. And so what does that look like in practice? I think can look really different depending on what your sort of sphere is of influence and where you're working. But I guess that's what I would say is the sort of lesson that I've taken away.
I'll piggyback off of that. I think one of the things I learned in the pandemic is that we need communities of practice. So communities, we know, help to ward off a sense of isolation, but they are also spaces where professionals who are in the midst of the chaos of the pandemic or other injustices can find a sense of being heard, seen, validated, identified with. And I saw across the country during the pandemic a lot of conversation circles popping up for chaplains of all sorts or for caregivers of all sorts, and they were able to talk about the care they were providing, maybe injustices inside of their institutions. And so I think that was kind of, to your point of solidarity, a really important lesson in the pandemic, that it is important for working and practicing professionals to come together to talk about what they see, what they experience, and the work that they do.
I can talk for a second. One thing that is talked about in the disabled community is called CRIP emotional intelligence, and it's just kind of little things, little tricks you learn being disabled in a world that's not made for you. And one of the things that the pandemic, COVID-19, kind of hammered home is that all the things that disabled people say they need, want, desire can happen. People just don't want to do it because it's not cost productive. It doesn't fit with the capitalist patriarchal society. The thing is for example, the people who had to go to work, the caregivers, the doctors, the nurses, the essential workers, and then the people who got to stay at home. Before that, like, you were told you had to go into the office to work. There's no way I could get hired to work, you know, from home for X job, work for Target from home, work for Byerly's from home, whatever you want to do, because that's just not how jobs work. You have to be in the office, you have to do it. Now everybody's working from home and doing part-time work and hybrid work and all that stuff. And yet disabled people who have been saying, well, hire me, I can do this job on my computer in bed, still don't get hired or haven't been hired. And so it's just little things like that. It's like when the crap hits the fan, so to speak, when there's push comes to shove, we will make sacrifices, we'll make changes, we'll get along, we'll do things. But then will we actually learn from that? Will we keep that momentum going? And that's kind of a choice that we as a society have to make. Do we want to go back? Everyone says, well, let's go back. And I don't want to go back, and I don't think a lot of people want to go back to the way it was before the pandemic, because I think it doesn't honor everybody. So that's kind of what I learned from the pandemic.
As I'm listening, a couple of thoughts popped in my head. One was, I think, how I'm just like being brought back to the early days of the pandemic and just sort of the intensity of it on many levels for people. And pretty quickly it was clear like how disposable people were in some ways on all levels, and how important it was then for people to get organized, to organize, to connect with people. I think about like within the healthcare field, like nurses have always had just sort of this amazing history of organizing, and I can think of some examples early on in the pandemic too, and that is in that spirit of solidarity. Like, we need to be together in this to build the power to sort of fight back against the systems that are just making people really disposable. Another lesson that I'm continuing to learn, I think, is, and I think I learned this during the pandemic, but is just the importance of slowing down in the face of what feels like intense urgency, and slowing down in ways that that allow trauma to heal, that don't re-traumatize, that make sure that we're sitting down and carefully thinking and listening to others. I know in medicine, in our training, we're often there's this sense of urgency that we're often feeling, and it almost becomes your sort of daily companion. And I found that COVID gave me the opportunity in community with some others to really think about, like, what does it look like to start deprogramming that urgency because of the harm that it can do when we're not careful and slow and thoughtful.
Thanks. I want us to talk about care work and exhaustion. I'm thinking of personal and social exhaustion, perhaps especially in light of COVID-19, but also in light of the ways in which capitalism creates exhaustion. I'm thinking of how capitalism depends on social reproductive activity. That is, it depends on the care work that makes it possible for people to become workers, for people to go to work so that profit can be made. By social reproduction and care, I have in mind everything that reproduces our lives, from the care work involved in being pregnant, the care work the body does to birth people, the care work of feeding and nourishing infants and raising children. I'm thinking of the care work that takes place in the home, which of course is often gendered. Things like cooking, cleaning, doing laundry, changing diapers, getting kids off to school, staying up late, doing math homework with children. Please, not me. It's not my favorite activity or my best. So all of these things are necessary for capitalism to continue to function, and yet they are not seen as part of the economy. They are seen as extra economic, or they are seen as private life activities. I think there is a sense in which capitalism cannibalizes these activities, as the philosopher Nancy Fraser has recently put it. On the one hand, capitalism needs us to do these things, and on the other hand, it does not value them and actually eats away at these aspects of our lives. We can think of radical feminist movements in the 1970s that campaigned around the slogan, wages for housework. So as our careless systems weigh down on us, we face multiple crises of care, which has led to massive exhaustion and this sort of eating away at the care work that we do on a daily basis to reproduce life. I'm wondering, I guess, if we could think together about this contradiction, how capitalism depends on the work of caregivers and yet seems to absolutely exhaust caregivers, both paid and unpaid. How might we address these issues creatively and constructively and concretely? How do we do something about this reality? Do you know what I mean? Does it? Yeah. I mean, how many of you are tired right now from caring for people all day? And how many of you have to go home to care for more people? Yeah.
Yes.
To the point where, okay, I'm spent. Why do you think we sit on our phones? We're exhausted,
So I put a lot of thought into this question. Right. And so I think that one of the products of white supremacy is the need to institutionalize care. And once care becomes institutionalized, it becomes reliant on capitalism to survive, and it becomes absorbed into a capitalistic culture. And so I think a way to address this is to embrace non-institutionalized systems of care or deinstitutionalize our care. And so talking primarily to spiritual care providers, I think there might be a contradiction there because chaplains are providers embedded within institutions. We provide, as chaplains, institutionalized care. Therefore, the care that I provide as a hospital chaplain is connected to and complicit in the capitalism that keeps the hospital doors open. And so if we truly, truly want to address issues of capitalism in care work, then as care providers, I think we need to divest from institutionalized models of care. And I know that that takes a large sense of privilege, but if I'm talking to chaplains, I'm talking to a field that is majority white, Protestant, middle-aged, with at least a master's level education. So I'm talking precisely to those with privilege in society. And then there are those of us who need to institutionalize our care to survive capitalism. And yet, in these communities, in my community in particular, African American women, there still is an internal and collaborative call to divest from these institutions and systems and to deinstitutionalize our care practices. And so wanting to think about unpaid labor, I know that I was raised by my mom and my sister and my aunties and my grandmother, and there was a network of childcare. I think that this was a network of deinstitutionalized care practice that was birthed out of necessity, and also would have existed if capitalism was not even a factor. This is an ancestral, a communal, a collective approach to care, this network of care. And thinking about midwifery and doula practices, there is, even in the Twin Cities, a really robust network of Black midwives and doulas who are not embedded in institutions and work to keep Black birthing people outside of institutions or out of institutions. And I think that network would exist even if capitalism was not a factor. It would exist in spite of capitalism, and it exists because of capitalism, right? And so I think when we think about these institutions of care, I don't know if they have the capacity to transform because they are connected to, so deeply woven with capitalism. But if we divest from those institutions and if we invest in networks of care that are more collaborative, communal, and maybe perhaps, for me, rooted in more of an ancestral tradition and practice, then I think we can address capitalism authentically.
Thinking I can riff off of that because that's sort of what I was thinking when I was thinking about this question. So right now I'm a student in a cohort of people that are sort of learning more about something, or that are kind of leaning into this idea of something called healing justice, which I'm not sure if it's like something that people have heard of before, but Kara Page, who is a cultural worker and actually a birth worker as well, that trained in sort of like a more of a Southern radical Black tradition of healing, wrote a book called Healing Justice Lineages with Erica Woodland, and it talks about these like lineages of care and healing that are very ancestral in a lot of communities. And I think about that. I grew up in a multi-generational household where everyone kind of just did the work of caring, and it was very similar, like out of necessity, but also the way that Kara Page sort of framed this for me in this cohort that I'm currently a part of learning about healing justice is that these are technologies, like the word that she used was technologies. Like these are technologies there are technologies around care that are sort of within us, that are ancestrally rooted, and that we can tap into those things and think about how we can also divest from capitalism, but also like disrupt in the spaces that we are in, but do that in a way that is connected to what other people are doing. So for instance, like how could something that might be an antidote, I guess, to exhaustion and burnout of dealing with a capitalist, like sort of medical industrial complex, which I'm very much embedded in as a physician, would be to organize with other doctors, like we do in the Campaign Against Racism, to think about like what does it look like in my position to sort of disrupt the medical industrial complex a little bit. What does it look like to be in solidarity with Black birth workers who are working outside of the system, and to sort of be someone who, if someone did have to enter the system for whatever reason, is working through a lens of solidarity or through a lens of like collective liberation, understanding that that there's multiple points of intersection. Like there just isn't one right thing or one right way that we combat capitalism, but there's multiple points. There's multiple points around that. The other thing that Kara Page has taught me, and Susan Raffel also, who's a somatic practitioner in the Twin Cities actually, also wrote an amazing book called Liberated to the Bone. So I'm very much a student of these people, and I'm learning right now. But another thing that they said, they talked about how oftentimes we think about like burnout and exhaustion as something very individualized, like I need to focus on my mental health, or I need to do something, or I need to take care of myself. And they said they said, let's reframe the way that we think about trauma. Like trauma is not individual, it's actually, we have a collective trauma, which is the way that our society is structured, which is capitalism and imperialism and ableism and heteropatriarchy and racism. And that has actually like disrupted our cultures. It's disrupted our ability to tap into those more like ancestral technologies of care. And so then liberation is also collective. It's not an individual endeavor. So you have to think about how you can do it how you can connect with other people. And use whatever strengths and skill sets you have, and in solidarity with other people. So I don't know, I'm kind of rambling at this point, but these are just some of the things that were coming to my mind when you were asking about like what's our antidote to exhaustion and capitalism.
I'll add one other thing that the question around how do we address these issues creatively. I think Arthi and I, along with some other health workers who have been exhausted and burned out by working in the medical industrial complex, a few years ago connected with a local theater troupe called the Zamia Theater Troupe, and they are a group, they've been around in the Twin Cities for over 15 years, and they are a group of people who have either current or previous lived experience with being unsheltered and unhoused, and they use theater really to change the narrative around housing issues and why people are unhoused here in the Twin Cities. And both Arthi and I are in settings and situations in which we, within the formal medical system, are sometimes attempting to connect with and provide care to people who are unhoused. And went to one of their shows and were really just blown away by the creativity and the energy, and reached out to them and have built a partnership which, for all of us who are involved, I think really gets us into our imaginative spaces, which I think is really healing and a real antidote for the exhaustion on a daily basis. And what that partnerships looked like has been co-creating some scenarios based on everyone's experience around the table of some of these harmful interactions that happen in the emergency room or in a clinic setting, and then using the theater of the oppressed to offer the scenarios to an audience, often of mixed audience of health workers and folks who are unhoused, to look at those scenarios, which are very unsatisfying but have really happened, and then get those folks involved on the stage, reimagining how things could be different. And it's a great, it's great for generating ideas, and I think this whole thing around an antidote to burnout as well, at least for me, has been really important. It's a very exciting, generative work that feels like it moves us beyond what can be really exhausting sometimes, which is just studying the problem and pointing out the problem. But the really exciting work is then thinking about, well, what could be different? Like, what do we really want this to look like?
Laura, do you have anything to add to that question?
I would just recommend a book called Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice by, and I'm going to try to do this name, I've been practicing it, Leah Lakshmi Pensna Samarasina. And if you can't get it from the name, just look up the title, because I'm really bad with names. But it's Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice. And it talks a lot about how to do care work outside of the systems. How do we do collective care webs? How do we care for each other outside of the medical industrial system, outside of capitalism, and yeah.
Thank you. Arthi and Mike, your involvement with the organization Equal Health, I know, is influenced and shaped by what is often called social medicine. Mike, I've heard you describe this work as analyzing the social determinants of health. I know that you are both actively involved in campaigns against racism in healthcare, and social medicine informs that work. I wonder if you, both of you, could share a bit about just what social medicine is and why you think it's an important lens through which to view questions of healthcare that are often hidden or obscured by more traditional approaches to medicine and healthcare.
Well, actually, we both are trying to figure out what should we say about social medicine so we don't overlap. So social medicine has a nearly 200-year history of essentially doctors, and I would say it's important to note, I think doctors need more help in this particular area than many others, but really it's the recognition that social forces are really at the root of either good health or bad health and health inequities. And it was born out in the 1850s when a German pathologist who was spending a whole lot of time looking under a microscope at the pathology in the body recognized that the issues that people were facing and the illnesses that they had at that time in a typhus outbreak had a whole lot to do with the fact that they didn't have public education, they weren't able to vote, a lot of different things that affected society in a way that created sickness. And it's gone through many, many different iterations. Arthi and I discovered it through our connections with Partners in Health. And I think it kind of has three threads to it. I think one is it's getting people to recognize the social and the structural determination of health, we turn to social theory and the humanities, which are not things that are typically part of traditional medical education, although that is starting to change. But recognizing we need to be turning to anthropologists and writers and political economists and historians, a lot of other folks to really fill in the gaps of the things that we're not taught in our medical training. And then the third thing is about action, which tends to be collectively building power with other people who share your lens in order to change social conditions. So.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that what that looks like on like a more granular level, I would say like in my day-to-day practice as a primary care provider is understanding that the person who's in front of me, who's coming in and who is sick, it shifts the lens of how you think about why they're sick. And so it pushes, I think social medicine asks us to push why, so that if someone is ill or if they're having even a mental health crisis, it's not because there's something intrinsically wrong with that person, right? It's the reframe is, this is actually a normal reaction to a pathological environment. This is and so then it forces you to say that if our role is to like help people heal or to help people be healthy, that we can't just prescribe a medication, or we can't just say like, oh, you know, you need to eat healthier. We need to actually think about like, what are the upstream factors that are actually creating the conditions that people are living and working and playing in. And so, and I'll say the other thing that I think social medicine brings in, right, is this idea of like accompaniment. And it's really influenced by like Paulo Freire's work, if you've read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or like the theater work that we do with Zamia is really inspired by the work of Augusto Boal, a Brazilian activist and educator. So it's really saying like the people who are most impacted too are the people, and so valuing sort of the lived experience of that someone has, and understanding that the solutions or to some of those, the ills of society also come from centering that person's experience and accompanying them to a process to understand how to shift it.
Thank you. And Laura, I want to ask you a question. Your work as a minister is in disability justice. I've heard you speak very passionately before about how we need to flip the script on disability. Rather than thinking of individual people as disabled, implying that a problem lies with a person's body, we need to think socially and structurally about how society actively disables people through decisions about infrastructure that privilege certain bodies as normative. I wonder if you could share a bit about your thinking on this matter and what kinds of changes must be made to ensure that all bodies are valued in our social life.
Thank you for asking. So again, kind of the answer to that question is the social model of disability, which says, I have impairments, I have dwarfism, I have arthritis, I have anxiety, those are all impairments. But they're not disabilities until they interact with society. So the fact that I don't walk is an impairment, but it's not a disability. It's a disability when my wheelchair can't access a building because there are physical barriers. There are steps, there are cracks in the sidewalk, there are no curb cuts, there's snow piled in front of the curb cut because the snowplow puts it there, and the city can't shovel it because it's not the city's job, but the people's house didn't put it there either, so it's not their job to shovel it, so I guess I just stay inside today. That's where the disability comes from. When people stare at you and giggle and call you names, and you don't want to leave the house, again, that's the disability. The impairment is the physical condition, but the disability is societal's response to that condition. And this, again, is the social model, which is different from the medical model, which I put in a sermon. The medical model says the problem is mine, the problem is me, which means the responsibility is mine and mine alone. But the social model, and I would say the correct model, is that disability is a societal problem and society's responsibility. And because I'm a minister, I come at it from a lens of biblical interdependence, and I come at that from a biblical lens because we are put on this earth to care for one another. Even God up in the sky is not God alone, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. God is an interdependent in a relationship with God's self. And we, as human beings, need to be in relationship with each other. And I'll briefly, because I know it's a long thing, but I wrote down 10 little things that really help. And the first one is just to care. And that's not something that, it's hard to teach, it's a real hard thing to teach. If people don't care, they don't care. But for myself to exist, for people with health issues to exist, others have to care. Care for me, care for themselves, care for the environment. An example is masking. That became a big political thing. That became a big, big thing. And if you put it simply, if you are immunocompromised, you don't want to leave the house unless you know people are going to wear masks. And I take risks every time I leave the house. And that's just one little example about caring. Number 2 is listen to marginalized people. In my example, it's disabled people, but it could be, people of color, it could be women. Really listen to their experiences. And if they tell you something and you've never experienced it, that's great that you've never experienced it, but it doesn't mean that it's not real. Disabled people are experts in their bodies and their life experiences. Make friends. Be friends with people who don't look and act like you. Friendship leads to genuine caring and awareness. Educate yourself. When I was younger and I didn't know about racism, I read books. When I didn't know about the LGBT community, I read books and asked questions. Don't always expect the marginalized person to teach you. We're here at a panel. We want to teach you. That's why we're here. But if you're in the grocery store and you see me and you go, well, what kind of shoes do you wear? What clothes do you go? Do you drive a car? Can you make babies? It's just like, what? I'm trying to buy cereal today. If you don't know a question, then just act. Once you do know stuff, once you're told little bits of information, do something about it. Call your legislators to change the archaic laws on disability that you've read about. Lobby, protest, support. Set up care networks, as found in the book that I mentioned earlier, Care Work. Care for people for free or for barter or for, don't always, make it, I listen to you talk about your marriage problems and you drive me to the grocery store. It's a trade-off. We don't have to exchange money. That's a creative outside the box. Expand your horizons. Don't live in a bubble. Give, I think we're at 8 now, give to organizations run by disabled people, run by women, run by Black people. Give directly to your disabled friends and family, and always pay in cash or gift cards, because there can't be checks. Don't recreate the wheel. Look to people who have done the work before you. As far as disability justice, there's a handout somewhere that I printed out. It's 10 Principles of Disability Justice, as noted by Sins Invalid, which is an organization. And they're even better than the 10 things I'm saying. And they have, you can go on their website, and it's just awesome. They've done this work before me. And interdependence. Those would be my 10 things.
Thanks, Laura. And Jessica, your teaching and research on chaplaincy and midwifery is informed by womanist theological and spiritual traditions. Your work examines anti-Black racism and gender-based violence against African American women, especially as it relates to harm and trauma caused by discrimination in medicine and healthcare. I wonder if you could share how womanist traditions, or how a womanist perspective as you understand it, might help to inform strategies and practices of anti-racism in the work of caregiving.
Yes. So we've been talking a lot about lived experience, and womanist work begins with the lived experiences of African American Black women. And these are experiences of oppression, such as racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ableism. And these are also experiences of resilience, hope, courage, flourishing. And so womanist spiritual care really hinges upon holistically caring for African American women in all of who they are, in their oppression-based trauma, and in their resilience. And so race and racism are large parts of Black women's experience, but not the totality of it. And so what I think womanism offers anti-racism is intersectionality, which was a term that we brought up earlier as well. So if practices of anti-racism aren't intersected with practices that address sexism, ableism, classism, heterosexism, then these practices aren't effective for the majority of BIPOC people, because we all live with lived experiences that intersect in some way.
Thank you. I want us to circle back and those of you online and those of you here in person, I want you to start thinking about questions. Those of you online, you can put those questions in the chat and we'll get to them. But before we do that, I want to circle back to the theme of the overall series, which is accompanying and accompaniment. And we've talked a lot about the social dimensions of healthcare and other forms of care and the importance of building infrastructures of care. We've talked about building alternative networks of care based on alternative traditions and practices. I want to ask more directly, though, what is the role of caregivers in the struggle for a more just world? Perhaps there's not a single role, but what are the roles, perhaps, of caregivers in the struggle for a more just world? And how might accompaniment inform our action? In short, what difference would it make if the many caregivers of our world, doulas, chaplains, grandmothers, pastors, nurses, doctors, accompanying with those with whom they care, worked together, walking, limping, rolling with people together to transform our careless social structures? What does that look like? Feel free to jump in, anybody.
I think that would be a beautiful future. I think if that happened, no one would be left behind, because everyone would be going at their own pace and waiting for the next person. If you wait for the least or the most marginalized, whether that's, whatever that person is, then you're connecting to everybody. There's a little cartoon that I used as the bulletin cover for a sermon once, and it had someone shoveling. There was snow in front of a school, and there were steps, and there was a ramp, and all the kids were lined up for the stairs to get shoveled, and then a couple kids were lined up for the ramp in wheelchairs, and the custodian was like, "I'll shovel the ramp when I'm done with the stairs, and then you can get through." And the kid in the wheelchair was like, "Well, if you shovel the ramp, then everybody can get through." So if you operate for the least marginalized of the group, or the most marginalized of the group, you're going to cover the basis for everyone.
I guess I would just say that, to me that looks like building in immense power. I think that, sometimes because we're so, I'll speak for myself, sometimes because I'm so trapped within a capitalist model of healthcare and a system that I think in some ways is making us sick and is dependent on people continuing to be sick. I think that sometimes I can lose sight of the power that I have to shift the system or to look at something in a different way. And I think that once I started organizing with other people, people with folks at Zamia and the people with REP and with our other partners in the campaign against racism, once I started doing, practicing intersectional solidarity and trying to show up more in that way, I realized, wow, people really have a lot of power and a lot of skills that they can lend to this. That, like you said, Jessica, that you don't need the system as much. And And I think that like these systems of inequity, like the medical system, I mean, they're only powerful in the sense that the people uphold their power, and so they operate through the sort of consent and assent of all of us. At least that's the way I think of it. And so if more of us were like, hey, like we're gonna kind of band together and not consent to this, that I think that could be really powerful and is really powerful. And there's demonstrations of how that is really powerful. But
thank you.
One of the things that Arthi and I also do together with some others is we offer, every fall, we offer a social medicine course for health workers. And this particular fall, and the class is really community-based. I mean, we spend time at the invitation of a variety of leaders in different spaces in the Twin Cities, the Rondo neighborhood, Badote, George Floyd Square. And one of the themes that continued to come up this time, it always does, but I feel like I heard it very consistently, was people talking about how important it is to know our neighbors. And it makes me think a lot about, I think like what caregiving to me feels like at its best, it's very relational and deeply local. And this whole idea around getting to know your neighbors made me think about 5 years ago, I had the chance to go and learn a little bit about the Cuban health system in Cuba, which is not a capitalist health system and delivers far better health outcomes there on much less money than we spend here in the United States. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting was that the doctor, nurse, and community health worker for each zone of population lived within that neighborhood. That was like, it wasn't that people were there in the clinic and then they drove to a place far away at nighttime. They lived in the neighborhood with people. And in some ways, I think that's like a model of accompaniment at its best, because there's that shared lived experience. And so I imagine it somehow looking something like that in some way.
The word that's coming to mind for me is presence, which is something that's talked about often in the chaplain community and also in the birth work community. During the pandemic, there was a fantastic, I think, New York Times article that spoke to when a lot of folks were leaving those who had COVID, leaving those who were ill. Chaplains were who were going towards them. Chaplains were choosing to be present amongst those who are experiencing injustice, chaos, etc. And I see the similarities in birth work. One of my favorite practices is just to sit in silence and to just keep watch over the environment and not say anything at all. And so I think that offering a sense of presence as care providers, continuing to go into these spaces, these marginalized communities, continuing to show up even in the midst of uncertainty with capitalism and our society, but continuing to show up and be present, I think would contribute to change.
Thank you. Well, I want to open it up to the room and to those online. I see lots of comments in the chat. We have about 16 or 17 minutes, so why don't we begin in the room here.
Thank you.
And Stella will bring you a microphone so that people can hear you online.
Thank you. I have a loud voice, so I sometimes don't want the mic too close to my face, but I wanted to thank all of you for being here and expressing solidarity with poor people. And something that, as an extremely low-income woman who raised 6 children on my own, without extended family help, but support from women friends, I became involved with the politics of unwaged labor. And I'm very glad that somebody brought up the Wages for Housework movement tonight, because it is at the root of this issue of the intersection of capitalism and caregiving, because all women give care, even those who are not mothers, they auntie, they often grandmother, they sister, people who have not those people in their lives. And I have never met a woman who didn't work, but her labor, unless she is a professional, does not have value in the existing systems. And I do think, and there have been sort of international examples of this, of how you count women's unwaged labor in the gross domestic product of nations. And there were international conferences of women throughout the 80s and early 90s that agreed to do that. In our own country, there was a bill as long ago as when Senator Kennedy was living to count unwaged labor of women in the gross domestic product. Because women do 2/3 of the world's work for a fraction of its pay. So if you have a tabulation of the value of their work, their invisible work, women who are relegated to the care of children out of love, but also out of duty, are spending their lives caring for children, people with disabilities, people who are elderly. And you return to being a child as you age. You become almost as a very smart child. If you've ever cared for people in their 90s, or a lot of people in their 90s or approaching 100. So I just wanted to say that there actually is a working model of how you can begin to give value to women's labor, and because that is what I've seen in my life, is that particularly low-income women of every background never stop working, particularly those who are low-income or no-income people. So thank you very much for the class solidarity here, because I do know, and of course doctors should be paid, nurses should be paid, doulas should be paid, but there's a huge gap between waged work, marginalized wage work, and no pay whatsoever. And women do most of the world's work.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And just a couple texts there to an author. Sylvia Federici is an important thinker on this subject, and Selma James, if you're interested in learning more about wages for housework, is a very important movement. Yeah. And some of these thinkers are still writing and still alive. Yeah. So.
Hi, thank you, everyone. And this feels like this question goes perfectly with what you mentioned about presence. My question is about breaking out of bubbles. Like, it often feels like it takes so much extra energy to find and connect with communities that don't share your perspective or your experience. There's algorithms on our phone that keep us in little vacuum-sealed bubbles. I'm a poor working class trans person who can't afford a car, so getting out to different communities can be take extra energy. So I'm curious what tactics y'all have used to find the energy to connect and stay committed to communities that don't share your perspective or experience, or are marginalized and can't come to you. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't know. I think for me, it in some ways has become almost like a matter of life and death. And I think that's because of just what I see every day. I think that's what has pushed us to do a lot of the work that we do, acknowledging that there's privilege there, and so how can I leverage my privilege to maybe come, to travel or to sponsor or something like that. I think that one of the campaign against racism that Mike and I are part of is a global movement, too. And so it's also rooted really in like transnational solidarity and understanding, like we have chapters that are all throughout the global South, and I think that really it's like there's this idea, right, that like people talk about collective liberation, like I'm not free unless you're free, but like what does that mean? And I think like our friends and comrades in Haiti and in you know, in India and in Rwanda and all over in Palestine and all over the world have really like opened my eyes, I think, to what that means. And so now it's become very personal. And I think Laura, you said it, like it's like you just become friends with people and then you realize like that it's really like it's just really important.
I love this theme of friendship. I was just reading Gustavo Gutierrez last night on the Good Samaritan and neighbor love, and he talks about how loving your neighbor, it's not just loving the person next door or near you, it's actually placing yourself in front of or in relation to the neighbor in need. And so there's a real intentionality to that. Again, with this posture, not of a kind of paternalism or something like this, but this posture of accompanying, listening, friendship. It is a question of sort of becoming friends with others, and then, right? And that can get tricky, I suppose. It's tricky with pastoral relationships, certainly with medical relationships. That's one of the challenges, right? How do we have those professional boundaries? And at the same time, how do we accompany people and work with people to address the social issues that they face and the personal issues that they face?
I think this question is parallel to your comments, maybe. I'm trying to hear accompaniment as not something you choose, because I think that might be an underlying assumption. But what if it's something that we're forced into? And I've only been thinking about this because I didn't know. I was looking at some data this morning that a lot of folks in this country think they're going to retire when they choose. But the data indicates that only goes to 30% of the retirement age population. 70% are pretty much forced into it. Either your labor leaves you, or you're forced out of it, or you have a health crisis that says, your employer just pretty much says, hopefully in a polite way, well, we're done, or you're done. So that's what's making me think about accompaniment. Like, I don't know if this is always a choice, and maybe that's something you all might want to reflect on, or the folks who are listening to, and those present. Thank you.
Do you want to comment on that, anybody, or? Okay. We have one more in the room, and then we'll go online to field some of the questions online.
I work for an organization, Clare Housing, that does extraordinary work. And as a gay man who's turned 60, I can look at society and say that we do live in some ways a much better world than we did 30, 40, 50 years ago. There are many difficulties to overcome, but I would charge that as easy as it is to look at the difficulties that we face in society and with illnesses and ailments, as you were just saying, I can't help but think, yeah, I can see today, I can walk today. Tomorrow is no guarantee. You're right, absolutely. we will all need someone to walk beside us at some point or another. My point of what I'm trying to say is to accentuate the positive where you find something that is working. Put your heart and soul and your back into it. And that's what I've found that I've been able to do at Clare. And I would invite any of you here to come and go to clarehousing.org and to book yourself a tour and come and check out the work that we're doing. Is it perfect? No. But we've come a hell of a long way.
Thank you
and
for
I know
sharing
that
that.
many of you in the organizations that you work for have done the same.
Thank you for sharing that.
I have a question. So I'm big into nature, and eco-chaplaincy is a newly coined term, I suppose. So I'm wondering, when we talk about friends, neighbors, accompaniment, care, how often or in what ways does the environment or nature, non-human beings, relate? So that could be in a caring for non-human nature relationship, or the healing that we receive, and how does that kind of fit into your various niches?
For me.
Mike spends a lot of time outdoors.
I do spend a lot of time outdoors. I wish that it was like much more of a, like I'm trying to think about the ways in which, within the walls of our clinic, like how do we connect those things for people? And one thought I had, which is a connection point, is our clinic is very close to the university in Lexington, and just a little bit further north of that, there's the Frogtown Farm. And folks are familiar with that, which is just this huge, amazing space that was preserved by the surrounding community, who really wanted to really honor how important nature is and being able to grow your own food right in the city. And there's also a center that's part of the Wilder Foundation there called the Center for Social Healing. And we've been able to connect with them and do a lot of work in referring patients into culturally based groups that happen there, and then utilize sort of the farm space as well. So I feel like that's just like a little baby step kind of thing, but it's like critical. I mean, I think a lot of people feel a whole lot more healing from that than any medicine that they get on any particular day. So that's one thing I'd offer.
Thanks. Let's try to get a couple, at least from online. Do we have some that we can maybe combine?
We do.
All right.
This kind of piggybacks off of some of the comments in here as well. But a couple people in the chat are bringing up a rise in young caregivers, so people who are caring for aging parents or children with disabilities. And Anji said, these folks' lives are being swallowed up by this level of care, and they're stymies their lives at precisely the time when they're meant to be establishing themselves in a capitalist system. How can we support these folks?
How do we support young people caring and the future care needs? Build infrastructures for care.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about just sort of what we've kind of lifted up this evening. The alternative practices, right? in ancestral traditions, the alternative practices that are outside of, that have been created either by necessity or because of creativity or because of our spiritual traditions, the very spiritual traditions that inform our ways of caring, that aren't so locked in by the compulsion of the system that we live in. So drawing on those, but then I'm also thinking about your example of the theater, right? And the need for radical imagination. So both drawing on these traditions and then also the creativity that theater can provide, that art, that other kinds of, that can open up our imagination to think about different ways of living in relation to each other so I don't know if that's the way to answer that question, but I think that it's a reminder, I suppose, or maybe there's a sense of urgency that comes with this question, that this isn't a merely intellectual or academic question, right? These are matters of life and death, and that if we value life, right, we need to be thinking creatively, and we need to be organizing, and we need to be imagining different ways of caregiving, which it might be a divestment, as you say, Jessica, in the institutions that we're currently living under. But how do we reinvest then in alternative infrastructures that do better work for us all? Are there other questions online that we want to field before we close?
Griffey asked about Pedagogy of the Oppressed, saying it's one of their favorite books, and they'd love to hear how y'all have adapted it or used it in your care work. Rye will have an answer for sure.
I mean, I could speak to that a bit. As a pastor, I think it's a beautiful book to read as a pastor, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I mean, it's a very important book. Part of what Freire talks about is he actually talks about love and making an act of love, and that's related to what he calls praxis. So being involved in relationships with others, specifically oppressed people, and it's through that involvement, through that praxis of acting with others, that we are able to build what he calls, consciousness about the social conditions that are affecting us. And so then also the possibility of changing those conditions. He's been very helpful in my work. He was influenced by liberation theology. He was a Brazilian educator, but also someone that people should read on some of this, on this topic. Do you have thoughts on that, Arthi? I know you mentioned him.
I was just going to say, yeah, I mean, I think I think Mike mentioned like the work we're doing with Zamia, which is very much, I think, with the theater group, and kind of co-writing these narratives and then forming the theater is very much influenced, even though forum theater was a type of theater that was coined by Augusto Boal. Augusto Boal and Paulo Freire are very close. And so they kind of learned from one another, and so it's a very similar. I think the other thing that we oftentimes talk about is in the way that we decide to teach, which I think education and teaching is a type of care also, and not this sort of like banking model, right, of like depositing education, depositing knowledge into someone else, but that it's really more of like a collective process, and it involves this idea of praxis, reflection, and then there's a very active component in it. And so we try to, in our social medicine course, we tried to emulate that through being in the community, reflecting and acting together with people.
Yeah, and it's about asking questions. You know, less about giving information, but asking questions, remaining curious about the world around us. Why is it like that? Does it have to be that way? I think this is Ferreri's model, and I think it's critical to asking critical questions to the world in which we live, that it doesn't have to be this way, actually, but we don't always have the time or the capacity to ask those critical questions that might open up our imaginations toward a different way of living and being. Any final comments from our panelists before we go? It is after 8. We have one more question? Okay. Hey, you want to make a comment? Okay.
So I'm one of these old white men who still have something to say, and what I have to say is each one of you has power. Just because you're a human being, you have power in what you say, what you do, who you touch. Doesn't matter where you come from, really. It just has to do with your soul. Each one of you has power, so don't be discouraged. Don't have your courage taken away by the systems that threaten all of us. As a person of privilege, at my age, I can see hope in you as individuals as we come together in our unique ways, but just every day, just do that thing you do, and that's enough. And lean into the people you love, and let them love you, and that's enough at the end of the day. You can't save the world, but you can do what you can do every day.
Thank you for that. I think we'll end on that note. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you all for attending this on a Wednesday evening, and just a reminder that our next event is with the Sacred Ally Quilt Ministry on March 6th, and that'll happen here. We'll have these beautiful quilts that were made, and we'll have a speaker, and then save the date for April 10th, which is the documentary about Alice and Stoughton Lind, which will be at the University of St. Thomas. Thank you again, and have a great night.